Welcome, nutritionradio.org listeners. This is Lonnie Lowry, a university nutrition professor of over 20 years, senior scientist, and podcast host of long-running shows like Iron Radio. This is its sister show and covers just nutrition from a variety of angles. Come on in for your brief weekly dose of commentary, critique, and probably a comedic touch when we have co-hosts. Let's see what's on tap this time. Thinking Thursdays for lecture time. Hey everybody. Well, on the weeks where there is a Thursday update, it's just going to be a clip of lecture, and I thought we might begin at the beginning. For those who have wondered what a Nutrition 101 class is like or how it begins, here you go. And I think this is especially relevant because there's ongoing pushback against science. Oh, I don't need science. I've got the blood, sweat, and tears kind of thing. You know, experience is great. It's definitely one of the ways to learn. I personally like both. So let's give it a shot. Again, it's just a clip from a real lecture. And because it's an important topic about research as evidence, what is quality evidence, we'll probably do a part 2 the next time there's a Thursday update. Here we go.
Okay, welcome to Nutrition. This is, of course, the audio lecture that accompanies the PowerPoint for Week 1, Class 1, or Week 1, Day 1. We're going to handle some introductions. We're going to talk about scientific concepts today, do some critical thinking. We're going to look at research as evidence. Nutrition is a science, and we use evidence-based practice. So we're going to set the bar high. We're not just going to go randomly look at some, guru, personal trainer person on YouTube or something like that, or cook or lay source. We're going to try to stick to higher quality sources of information, and we're going to actually discuss about what that means. And then we're going to end up today with some nutrient terms, things that you're going to need to know moving forward in this fast-moving online course. So I digress. Let's go to our first slide here. I just think it's an interesting one. This is from Science Daily, and this is not spanking new, but I kept it because it touches on some very important key points. It's entitled, Can Prunes Reverse Bone Loss After Menopause? Now, we'll talk a lot about calcium and vitamin D and bone health later in the class, but prunes is not one that would come to mind, even to a lot of nutritionists, I think, when it comes to something like bone health. But if we look at this, it says, could a handful of nutrient-rich dried plums each day, that's prunes, keep the doctor away? Or even possibly reverse bone loss. So let's just look at the bold material here. Sometimes I'll show you a wall of text, and we're just looking at the bold stuff, highlighted stuff. Participants in this study in 2 treatment groups were given 500 milligrams of calcium per day and 200 international units of vitamin D per day. And that's not the treatment itself. That's just to make sure everybody is getting adequate bone nutrition. Okay, calcium and vitamin D. And then, importantly, if you look at the bold here, then they put them in a DEXA. We'll show a picture of a DEXA unit during this semester, but a DEXA, I'd love to get one in my own lab, actually, but it does body composition, body fatness, leanness, but it also does bone density. You sort of get this picture of a skeleton on the table as the subject lays down. It says, hopes were high for those plums. In a 2004 study that was done by one of these researchers at Oklahoma State University, they found that the diet supplemented with dried plums produced significant restoration of bone mass. In other words, they could see in the group that got the plums, right, the prunes, brighter, more dense bones registered on the DEXA unit. So again, diet supplemented with dried plums produced significant restoration of bone mass in female rats whose ovaries had been surgically removed. Now, this brings up a couple of other points. You might say, well, that's rats, Dr. Lowry. That's right, it is. Oftentimes we use animals in research, and often they're a pretty good approximation of human beings. But yes, species differences do matter, sometimes more than others. Also, what's up with this ovary removal thing? That's because the ovaries are a source of estrogen, and estrogen is very bone protective. Sex hormones, estrogen in women, testosterone in men, very bone protective, and that's why they they got estrogen out of the picture because they want to look at the phytochemicals or these special plant compounds in these plums. This study, at least very interesting, that they may actually help with bone health. Okay, sometimes I just like to start with some recent studies or whatnot. So let's start with a quick slide here. Nutrition. It's based on science. Why do we need science? Is this title of this slide. Essentially, there are different ways we know what we know. I don't want to launch into a discussion of philosophy and epistemology, but sources of knowledge include a couple of things. Tradition. It's one of the ways we know what we know. It's always been done that way, kind of thing. Authority. Like a professor or a textbook. You're going to, on some level, believe an authoritative figure when they give you a fact. Trial and error. The problem with that one, of course, it's a little bit messy. For example, if I were to ask you, what's the answer to 2 plus 2? And if you used random trial and error, you'd say 99, 12, 17, 1,033,033. It would take forever for you to get to 2 plus 2 equals 4 kind of thing. So it's not very efficient at all. There is logic, and we employ logic quite a bit, but logic can even break down a little bit. And I don't want to go into too much about that. There's also the scientific method. The scientific method is underlined and bolded here because it's what we use. It's what we use in the sciences. We make observations. Essentially, it's observe and record, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So again, just recapping this slide. Tradition. It's always been done a certain way. Now, that's been abused throughout history, certainly. Just because it's always been done a certain way doesn't mean it always works. In fact, you know what? Let me tell you a quick little story about tradition. There's a story about a woman who her mom always cut the ends off of the holiday ham every year. And so she did it too. She did it because it came out perfect every time when she was growing up. But one holiday she said, "Mom, why do we always do this? I mean, the hams are always perfect, but why do we do this? I end up, setting it aside or throwing away the ends of the ham. And why do we do this?" And she said, "Oh, honey, we had a small stove when you were growing up." So you can see the idea here is there are some flaws with tradition. There's some flaws with authority. It's been abused throughout history. Trial and error, we said, was inefficient. And then logic, let me give you an example of how logic might break down. There's something called the fallacy of division, for example, where you have two true premises, but you end up with a bogus conclusion. For example, premise 1, avalanches are dangerous. Do you agree with that? You should. Another is avalanches are made of snowflakes, as our second premise. Also true, right? But the conclusion, snowflakes are dangerous. That's spurious, right? Yes, avalanches are dangerous. Yes, they're made of snowflakes. But snowflakes are not dangerous. So that's called the fallacy of division. So these are ways that our sources of knowledge have some issues with them, and that's why we rely on science. Science has error-correcting machinery, as we're going to see. So let's move to the next slide. This is evaluating nutrition information. Before we get neck deep in science, we're just going to talk about this, evaluating nutrition information. First, when it comes to scientific research, researchers actually form an educated guess, a hypothesis. So the first major key term here is hypothesis. It's an educated guess or a possible explanation about what the researchers think they're going to see. For example, if I have two groups, and like the prune study at the beginning of this lecture, if you give one group real prunes and the other group gets fake prune powder, you might have reason to believe, and your educated guess is that the prune powder is going to increase bone density. That would be your hypothesis, that prunes increase bone density in rodents. Now, experiments are what we're talking about here. Your hypothesis is what your educated guess might be when you make a comparison. A lot of university students don't think like this, but eventually they learn to think more and more as a comparison. So you have a control group that gets, for example, the placebo or the, I just mentioned fake prune powder. And then there's a real nutrition intervention. The real intervention is what you're expecting to pull away from the other group in some way. Weight loss or weight gain or bone density or whatever. So we gather some data. We analyze, conclude, and discuss that data. The study supports or weakens an idea. It doesn't prove anything. Research doesn't prove anything. When you watch the evening news, in fact, it drives me crazy. I'll see science journalists say, a new study proves. No. Not to be too judgmental, but I want to break out my professor's red pen. That's already incorrect. Studies don't prove anything. They speak in probabilities. They support or weaken an idea. And then lastly on this slide, the final word is theory. A layperson thinks a theory is sort of weak. Oh, that's just a theory. But in real science, this suggests that many experiments all point to the same conclusion. If they all support a hypothesis, that's really quite strong. Theories are quite strong to scientists. So then we basically accept the research hypothesis. If we go to the next slide, we've got a couple of stars and bolded material, again, on the science concepts. When we talk about experimental designs, there's a couple of things we have to think about. The first one is actually not a true experimental design. The first key term here with a star is epidemiology. So epidemiological studies look at relationships. They don't find cause and effect. So an epidemiological study might be something like you hear that Japanese fishermen who drink green tea are leaner, right? They have less obesity. We don't know that the green tea is causing it. We just know that there's a relationship. They drink a lot of green tea, and that's got an inverse relationship with their body fat, right? The more green tea they drink, the less body fat they seem to have. But the reason it's not causal is because there's a lot of other things in those epidemiological studies. Their physical activity levels, for example, are very high. Maybe it's the soy that they eat, or the fact they're eating rice as their grain more so than wheat, like other cultures might, like in the U.S. You get the idea. So epidemiology or epidemiological studies study relationships. They don't provide cause and effect. Now you might say, well, then why do we use them? Well, because you can look at thousands of people. So even though it's just relationships, those can point researchers to future, more controlled studies. In fact, our second main term on this slide is controlled studies. Big star next to this, cause and effect. So there's a couple of different ways we do controlled studies that this slide points out. Lab animals. We already talked about how species-specific differences may occur. In vitro studies, that's in a dish, where you might be looking at fat cells in a dish or muscle cells or something like that. And, one group gets bathed in certain nutrient broth and the other does not, something like that. There are, of course, human experiments where you have a control group who gets nothing, or a sugar pill, placebo type thing, and then the other group gets the real intervention, a dietary supplement or a nutrient-enriched food product, whatever. In my own research, I'll often use decaffeinated coffee as the control group, right? And then I'll use real coffee as the intervention. And then I go see if people can, if their nerves and muscles function differently, for example. There are case studies. This isn't really an experimental design, but a case study is sometimes important when you have a rare genetic disease, and this does happen in nutrition. We're going to talk about it. Rare genetic diseases where you study one person and you just write down everything you know about this person and look for clues. Obviously, using more than one person, using multiple people, divided into multiple groups that you can compare, right, is a better approach in a controlled study. And the last two terms on this slide are single blind and double blind. Some of you may know about what this means, but single blind studies mean the research subjects, the participants, don't know what they're getting. Like in the studies that I perform, the people that are drinking decaf, they don't know it's decaf. It tastes and looks the same as the real coffee, that kind of thing. That's single blind. The participants don't know. The other term, the final term on this slide, is double blind, and that means neither the researchers nor the participants know, and that's really the strongest approach, because then we can't accidentally influence a person because we know. Even if we're not trying to cheat as researchers, we may accidentally speak more strongly, or our body language may be different, something like that. So double blind means neither the research participants nor the researchers know what the real intervention is.
And that's the end of the lecture clip, just starting on some basics. Again, there'll be a part 2 coming next Thursday update. The nutritionradio.org podcast is for informational purposes only. If you're interested in starting a diet or exercise program, check with your physician, nutritionist, or qualified exercise physiologist in order to make the progress that you need.